Thanks, Charles. Good morning, everybody. The first thing I would like to say that perhaps I wouldn't call myself an expert or an expert on Brazil. Why? Because, as you know, experts are getting a pretty bad name recently. They couldn't see Trump coming, they couldn't see Brexit coming, and can I go on and on. So let's settle for a kind of educated guesser on this thought. And this is particularly important as a disclaimer in terms of talking about Brazil, because all politics by nature are unpredictable. Again, see what happened in the United States, but some are more unpredictable than others. And I would perhaps put Brazil in that category, just as sort of to try to illustrate why I'm saying that. Look at former President Lula da Silva. Not so long ago, 3-4 years ago, President Obama called him the most popular politician on earth. If there was such a position as president of the world, and Lula had run, maybe less than 4 or 5 years ago, he usually have a very good chance of winning. And now he has a realistic chance of being in jail in the not so distant future. So that shows the sort of highs and lows of Brazilian politics. And they were saying, well, I'm going to be an optimistic and realistic way than what they're going to say. So what I'm going to say today, well, first I would have a kind of 5-minute or less introduction to try to understand why Brazil is in the situation that is here. Then I will move to the present government to see what is the composition, what are the strengths and weaknesses, and what are the main risks that it's facing. Then I will move a little more forward-looking and look at the agenda reform, what is the agenda, what are the possibilities of being passed to the 2018 election, and then I will round up with a few things about the economy and investment. Anyway, so let me start by looking at the current political crisis. Of course, any political crisis is a combination of people and institutions. Institutions are not by essence corrupt. People are corrupt, greedy, they make miscalculations, they make mistakes, and there were a lot of that in the current political crisis. But I think if you want to look at Brazil, you have to look a little bit beyond the individual mistakes of politicians or parties. Because the questions of corruption and miscalculation of the previous government of President Rousseff is not particularly new in Brazil. Behind that, there are institutional drivers that they do not justify individual greed or corruption or miscalculations, but they explain it, they show what are the incentives. And this has to do with two questions. First, the electoral rules, and second, the structures of governance in Brazil. What about the electoral rules? Well, basically, Brazil has a quite sort of peculiar electoral political system, not unique to Brazil, but is that not many countries that are here, that are there. It's a combination of presidentialist and open list, what's called in the jargon, political jargon, open list proportional representation for the election of congressmen, the Chamber of Deputies, and large magnitude electoral districts. What are the implications for that without going into too much details about how this operates? Well, they make elections very, very expensive, large magnitude electoral district. If you are running for the Chamber of Deputies in São Paulo, the whole state of São Paulo, which is much bigger than most countries, would be your constituency. So it takes a lot of money and a lot of travel to be elected congressman for São Paulo. And it also favors political fragmentation, these open list proportional representations. Candidates are basically running by themselves, not in representation of a party. They are competing with other candidates for their own party. So there is very little party loyalty. And there's a lot of incentive for party fragmentation. And the result is that you have about, I think, last count, something like 28 parties represented in Congress, which is well above the sort of average in sort of mature democracies. And this brings to the second question, the difficulties of governability. As you can imagine, you have 28 parties represented in Congress. It would be very difficult for the winning party, for the party of president, to have a majority in Congress. The previous government, the PT, has less than 20%. So what you have to do, you have to build a big parliamentary coalition to be sure to pass your law. And when I talk about big, I'm not talking about 50, 51%. You have to go well above that. Why? For two reasons. First, because you need to have a two-thirds majority to be able to pass, if you want to pass a constitutional amendment, which are very important. And second, because there is very little party discipline and organization. You cannot count, okay, I have 10 deputies for party A and be sure that these 10 deputies will follow the party line. Two of them may follow, three of them will not. So you need a lot of sort of parliamentary support to be able to govern. How you ensure that in parties that have very little in terms of ideology, discipline, etc.? Well, basically by distribution patronage and ultimately corruption. And this is exactly what the previous government done. They didn't do it very different from other governments in the past. They were just caught at it. And this was the last point I would say. So why they were caught? Well, for a number of reasons, but basically because over the past few years, the law enforcement and judicial system has become more autonomous and more forthright in investigating this allegation of corruption. When I'm talking about the justice and law enforcement system, I'm talking particularly about the federal prosecutors and, to a certain extent, the federal police. The judiciary itself is relatively autonomous, but is extremely inefficient. So you have this combination in Brazil that you have tens or, in this case, maybe hundreds of politicians that are under investigation of corruption, that are indicted for allegation of corruption, but very few of them go to trial and get sent to jail. Some of them have been in the last few years, and this has been a change. And so this is the root causes of the sort of situation that led to the fall of Dilma Rousseff. And to that you have more conjunctural and more personal mistakes. Rousseff in 2014-15 faced what we can call a perfect economic and political storm. Falling commodity prices. This is common to all the countries of the developing world and South America, but in particular affected Brazil. And there was one thing that is specific about that, falling commodity prices. We all know that commodities, like the economy, go in cycles of, but in many countries of South America, and this was the case of Brazil for reasons I could explain later, they didn't particularly see it coming. To use the cliche, they thought that this time was different, that China would continue to buy commodities at high prices for, not forever, for a very long time. So they took them as a surprise. They did miscalculations. They did political mistakes also based on that assumption, and based also, they did miscalculations, they did calculations as well. The elections were coming. They knew that the economy was slowing down, but they continued to spend as nothing had happened because they had an election to win. And the result of that immediately after the election, in which they would promise there will be no austerity, that will life continue to be great for all Brazilians. Not soon, less than a few days after the election, they have to completely go back in their policies and try to implement a program of orthodox program of fiscal authority. And this was, as you can imagine, politically disaster for the government. So broken electoral promise. And to this you have the corruption scandals, the so-called car wash operation, and mass popular protests. They started before the election for different reasons. They continue after the election because people felt that they were being cheated by the sort of failed promises of Dilma Rousseff and by the corruption allegation. And this completely drained parliamentary support for Dilma Rousseff and led to her impeachment. That's basically what we are where we are. This was reflected in the recent municipal election. I think there are three important conclusions from municipal elections. First, voters expressed the dissatisfaction that is cut across all sort of sectors of Brazilian society with a political system. How did they express that? With a kind of 40% abstention, spoiled ballot, and blank votes. You would say, well, 40% for a municipal election is not that bad. But you have to remember that in Brazil, voting is compulsory, so 40% is a lot. So a rejection of the political system, but particularly a rejection of the previous ruling party, the Workers' Party, the PT, who was decimated in the election. They lost about 2/3 of the municipalities that they had won 4 years ago in 2012, including the jewel in the crown of Brazil municipalities, the city of São Paulo. How did the other parties did? They did the parties that were basically now part of the coalition government, the center and center-right party, they did it better. They didn't brilliant, but they did it much better than the parties of the left that were blamed for the corruption and economic mismanagement. They still, the party of the president, the PMDB, lost the crucial city of Rio de Janeiro, but remains sort of quite a strong force nationally, which was to be expected. And the third thing that I think is interesting is the election of an outsider, a businessman, quite controversial, João Doria, as mayor of São Paulo in the first round election, which is quite a political achievement. This has two implications there. Something I will talk a little bit more when I talk about the electoral prospect for the presidential election, a sort of outsider winning one of the most important executive positions in Brazil. And second, he was backed by the current governor of São Paulo, Geraldo Alckmin, against most of the other bosses of his own party. And so this strengthens perhaps Alckmin's possibilities for being the candidate of the PSB in the 2018 election. More on that a little bit later. So this is, I think, the sort of very brief introduction of how we are and why we are where we are now. So my second question is try to look at the current government. So first, of course, this is the new president. I have to look and double check that they're actually two different persons. And I assure, yeah, of course, you know that this is Francisco, but this is genuinely a picture of Michael Temer. And I think that the interesting thing, it goes beyond the sort of this uncanny similarity, resemblance. It goes to the two of them are consummate insiders in politics. Of course, Temer is a president, was a different position, but they are willing and dealers, and they are consummate insiders. They are very conservative in their ways, and that makes what sort of Temer is, a sort of lawyer from a conservative family, part of the political system. And perhaps the other thing is he is not a very popular politician. He has never been very good at winning elections. He has been in Congress, of course, but he's not one of these sort of natural charismatic. He's a more behind the scenes, willing and dealer guy than one of these politicians, one of these Lula da Silvas of South American politics that are unable to, electrify the public. And so let's have a look at the new government. This is the first cabinet that Temer appointed just a few months ago. A couple of things that are interesting about, three things that are interesting there. First, it's not really a new government. Most of these guys were ministers or in other positions under the previous administration. Second is that all of them, as you can see, are white males in such a racially diverse society in which, surprise, about half of the population are women. And third, the ones that they are under the kind of red thing is people that are being have been named to surround an investigation under the car wash operation. And already, I'm not sure, 6 or 7, I think the last count is 7 ministers have to resign because of different allegations of corruption. Now you said, well, okay, well, they made this mistake in the past, they were corrupt in the past, Surely now they will be more careful, they will not be sort of, falling sort of in the old game again. Well, you guessed wrong, because this is the most recent case, only a few days ago, last week. This guy, which is called Jedel Vieira Lima, he was, until last week, President Temer right-hand man, Minister Secretary President. The guy effectively that liaised the executive with Congress, the guy that knew how to work Congress and secure support for the government in Congress. And what is more extraordinary about this incident, I don't know how familiar it is, that it kind of municipal corruption rather than Brazil scale national corruption. The guy was forced to resign last week because he pressed the Ministry of Culture to relax the planning regulations in the city of Bahia to allow a taller than this sort of tower block. The high regulation, this is a conservation area of Bahia. This guy was supposed to bought a flat in one of the higher floors of this building, which should have planning permission, and he pressed the Ministry of Culture to allow a sort of relaxing of the regulations and be able to build this tall tower. And the Ministry of Culture, who is obviously not corrupt, he refused. They went to President Temer, and President Temer kind of backed this guy until it obviously became unsustainable, and this guy was forced to resign. If you are interested, the market price of the apartment is 2.6 million reais, which is a bargain, I would say, looking at the prices of London. So if you want to buy, maybe they're available. My only advice, don't buy one in the higher floors, because probably you will not get planning permission after that. But what the extraordinary thing is the nature of the corruption, how ingrained it is, how the government lost his right-hand man under this situation. So again, when you talk about if you're optimistic or pessimistic, maybe you have to take that into account. Anyway, so looking at this government, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the new government? Well, you immediately see that there is a lot of overlap between the strengths and weaknesses, and I go to about that. The first thing about what I said about President Temer being a consummate insider, and this is important because that's what Dilma Rousseff was not, and one of her mistakes, not perhaps one of the. He knows how Congress works. He has been in Congress for ages. He knows how Congress works. He knows everybody in Congress, and he knows how to oil the wheels that get Brazil political system working. And he did it. He showed it by the coalition that he formed. He showed it by the way he played the game in the indictment of Rousseff and so on. The second, you'd be surprised, a weak and unpopular government. Well, yeah. And this is, I think this is a cue from what a businessman told the government. You are weak and unpopular. Take advantage of that to pass unpopular measures, because you cannot think much further. You have nothing to lose. And so use your unpopularity to make bold, bold reform that may lift you out of the floor that you are. And there is some truth on that, I would say. The third one is economic crisis and strengths. Well, again, I take this clue. Some years ago, as I said, I worked in the countries South America, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. I was researching in, as some of you might know, 2002, there was a big, massive financial crisis in Argentina that spilled over to Uruguay. So I was doing some work on that and interviewed many players at that time. And I interviewed the guy who was a Minister of Finance in Uruguay at that time. And the guy gave me the best soundbite of the sort of many interviews. I said, well, financial crisis, he told me, they take power out of you, but they give you power. And I think you understand probably what it is. They take power out of you. Of course, you run out of money. You cannot do the thing you promised to do. But they empower you because people are desperate. Take us of this mess. Do whatever you do, to sort the situation. So you can bold, you can try new things, you can propose radical reforms. And I think this is really true about financial crisis. And a clear strength is, and big difference from the previous government, is the broad parliamentary support that the current government has. Toward the end of his mandate, Rousseff had a very brief second mandate. Rousseff had completely lost her parliamentary base. This guy has very solid parliamentary support, as seen by some of the recent votes. The other strength is an opposition that is weak and demoralized. The other two things that, again, are important is, different with Rousseff, very strong business backing is unconditional, will be forever, no, never is forever, but at the moment is very firm, and there's no alternative. Basically, there's no alternative. So these are considerable strengths. The weakness, the first one is this government has no electoral mandates. I don't think that the impeachment was a coup, as I mean, but it was pretty bad for democracy that a government that a president has not been elected by popular mandate is currently in office. By far, the biggest weakness, and I go to elaborate a bit about there, is the corruption allegations. I mentioned about the ministers that are being investigated, and a little more on that. Again, an overlapping a consummate insider in a moment in a conjuncture in which politicians are despised in Brazil, not only in Brazil maybe, but particularly in Brazil, being an insider is not a popularity asset, if you want to be. And of course, the economic crisis, as I said, they give you power, but also they take out of power you. If you are running the kind of deficit that Brazil is running now of 6% of GDP, you will have to make cuts, and they are pretty tough. And then the Congress continues to be fragmented. These 28 parties, they still are there, and it's difficult to bring it together without what the oil that oiled the wheels of this coalition, which was corruption. So you have to try to cut off corruption at the same time, convince this sort of broad and sort of coalition to support particularly unpopular measures. It's not easy. So what are the main political risks facing the new government? I think there are, I mentioned 5 there. The first one, again, I mentioned, I will say a few more things in a minute or two, the question of corruption. This will involve, for sure, current ministers. Some of them are already under investigation. A few others will be an investigation in the next few weeks, but also members of Congress, which is also quite significant. The second risk is something that is under the Supreme Electoral Court will deliver a verdict in the next few days or weeks about a call for declaring the 2014 election illegal and unconstitutional or whatever it is, because of the corruption and other questions. Possibilities of indictment and corruption, certain. What will the Supreme Electoral Court will declare the election void? I think it's very unlikely. So not. Third question, return of mass protests to the streets that significantly weakened the Rousseff government. Well, to a certain extent, the street protests haven't gone away. Only yesterday they were protesting in Brasilia, but they have came down quite significantly in numbers. They're not a risk to the government right now. Could they become a risk? Yes, they could in 2 circumstances. First, I would discuss later if there is some kind of amnesty passed by Congress to the allegations of corruption. And second, in terms of the gender reform, the social security reform, and other reform that have clear losers that can sort of union, etc., that can generate protest. And this could lead to the erosion of parliamentary support and the situation very similar to the Rousseff government. So corruption allegations, they are there and they will increase. The annulment of the 2014 election, very unlikely, but it's out there. The return of mass protest, not right now into a volume that would threaten the government, but it may happen depending on what the economy does, depending on the reform, depending on what the political system does about the corruption allegations. And the parliamentary support, well, if the economy doesn't recover, if the government is still more unpopular, if there is more corruption allegations, you never know. Just a little bit about the corruption allegations. I think that there are three questions that are important about that. One that we'll know more about that before the end of the year, certainly. The main construction company, Odebrecht, that was involved in this, in bribing politicians, this car wash, there is a deal between the executives of the company and the federal prosecutors that they will, the deal is of course getting leniency in exchange of information. The deal is signed, and this executive will begin to make their statement to the prosecutors probably for the end of the year. People that are in the know, they think that between a minimum of 50 and perhaps in the hundreds of politicians, so not just ministers, but a lot of members of Congress will be named as having received bribes from this just one company, Odebrecht. So that will, the potential to have a huge political upheaval, so there will be a wipeout of a significant number of congressmen. So the big question is, what will Congress and the political class will do about that? There have been talks, persistent talks, or even initiatives in the last few weeks, about some kind of amnesty for past crimes of corruption, for receiving bribes or whatever. President Temer said he will veto any such law, but the pressure for Congress would be significant. And if you're a congressman, what would be better for me or less worse for me? Being unpopular because I voted an amnesty for something I had done, or going to jail. You make the choice. So in a certain way, they are dumb if they pass an amnesty law because it will be hugely unpopular, but they are dumb if not, because many of them have a clear danger of going to jail. Maybe we will not pass an amnesty law, something different, but there is a lot of speculation about that. And the third question, which you don't read so much in the press, is this guy, Eduardo Cunha, the former president of the Chamber of Deputies, that has been stripped of his mandate for accusation of corruption. And so he's now facing real danger of going to jail. And I think it's very likely he will again try to make a deal with the prosecutors to give information in exchange of leniency. And the guy knows everything that needs to know about corruption. And he feels that he has been betrayed by President Temer, so there are already things that have been saying, well, I know where I don't think that can bring Temer down. So this is, I think, the main questions about that. So I said that Rousseff faced a perfect storm. What would be the perfect storm of this government? I think that would be the perfect storm. We don't know, but there is the possibility that not only Cunha, but other branch executives will involve President Temer in the allegation of having taken bribes. As I said, Congress or congressmen will very certainly demand some kind of protection from the government or some kind of green light to pass an amnesty law that will save them from jail. And there could be a trade-off. Well, you either save our skin if you want to vote us to vote the reforms, or we don't vote the reforms. So maybe this will slow down quite significantly or stop the process of voting reforms in Congress. You know what it will do for economy. Economic confidence is pretty low. Will completely sort of, the economy will drag on. I will completely lose confidence in the economy. and business will lose trust in the government that will have the right economic policies. The middle classes, maybe those affected by the reforms will come back to the street in significant numbers. That will be the perfect storm. What are the chances of this happening? Not that high, but not impossible. Would depend a lot on what happened to the president, but at this, basically, both the political elite and the business elite know that this government is the only game in town at the moment, and I think they will do the most that they can to not to completely sort of wreck the government or force a resignation or whatever, but it's not impossible. Okay, let me just look at now a little bit forward-looking in terms of the agenda reforms and the 2018 election. This is basically the main agenda reform that this government has on the table. Now, as perhaps you can guess from my age, I have been following Brazil for a long, long time. Of this agenda reform, I think since I've seriously began to follow Brazil in the 1990s, the only new one is the first one, the constitutional amendment setting up a ceiling of public spending. All the others they have been on the table as long as I can remember, which means, obviously, that they are not so easy to pass. And I'll say a little bit about that. The constitutional amendment is setting up a ceiling on public spending. Why is the tick there? Because it's almost certain that it will be passed. It has been approved by the Chamber of Deputies. I think it was yesterday, before yesterday, was passed in the first vote by the Senate, and it's almost certain that they will become law before the end of the year. I guess you more or less know about what this is about. It's for the period of 20 years, there will be a ceiling in primary public spending, that is spending before the payment of debt interest, or at the 2017 level of expenditure. This, on the one hand, of course, it is an important measure in terms of restoring confidence in the Brazilian economy and putting the budget into a much more sustainable question. But it's also, as you can realize, is quite unprecedented, not only in Brazil, but everywhere. I don't know if you know any other country that has a similar sort of such a long-term sort of straitjacket on public spending. I don't know whether there will be a revision after 10 years where this can change. Some expenditures are protected from that, as health, education, but it will put a very, very strong straitjacket on that. Would that be viable? I very much it will be viable for 20 years, maybe even for 20 years. It doesn't matter. Then what is matter is in the next 3, 4, 5 years, they more or less follow that to change the trajectory of public spending. Pension reforms. I'll say a little bit more about the relation between the first and second reform, the ceiling to public spending and pension reform. Why? Because without pension reforms, the ceiling of public expenditure will be basically unsustainable. I'll show you a little bit later why. Would it be passed? Well, again, people that observers of Brazilian politics, and they have mixed idea. I think the baseline that some kind of pension reform, I think it will be passed, but probably will not be the kind of pension reform that, economic experts or economists would like to be, but some kind of pension reform would be passed. The pension system in Brazil has two questions. First, it's extraordinarily expensive, and second, it's extraordinarily unfair. For the very sort of elite of workers that are in the public sector and some that have this pension system is one of the most generous in the world. Something in my profession, a university lecturer, can retire in their late 50s and early 60s with basically the full pension equivalent to their full final salary. I wish I could. I'm not be here today, probably, if I was that. And as I said, it has been in the agenda for years. Pension reform are difficult. They have very clear losers that can mobilize public sector spending, whatever, but some reform may be passed. Political reform, again, I show up the problems of governability in Brazil, and there are some initiatives basically aimed at bringing down the number of parties that are represented in Congress. I think there's something like 28, bringing them down. There are a couple of initiatives that have been passed by the Senate already, establishing a threshold of 2% rising to 3% of the national vote to be able not to be elected to Congress, but to, after being elected, to receive public funding and free electoral time, which are the big prizes. Would they be passed by the Chamber of Deputies, where most of the party are represented? Not sure about that. But maybe with that. And again, tax reform is something that has been in the agenda for years and years and years. Have two components there. One, to try to simplify the tax system in Brazil. And second, more politically more difficult, is to change the tax allocation between the federal state and the state. So tax reform, I think, is not an immediate priority for the government. I think that maybe if the economy turns around, if the economic plan appears to be successful, maybe late 2017, maybe something like that. I wouldn't bet on that. And labor reform is a shorthand for what Brazilians call the Brazilian cost, labor cost, very high labor cost in Brazil. Again, labor reform is one of the most difficult to pass, together Social Security. Look at the 1990 Latin America, where the sort of high days of sort of privatization, liberalization, structural reforms, or whatever. Countries privatized, apparently did a lot of kind of free market reform. Very few countries did labor reform. There are a couple of initiatives, not legislative elections, but been considered by the labor court that would flexibilize labor, particularly one which is quite important in terms of contracting out contracting out labor for essential. Well, it's a little bit complicated. You can, on the Brazilian law now, contracting out non-essential questions like, you know, lawyers can contract out cleaning or restaurant or catering or whatever, but not the core business of law. That could be extended. That will give you a little bit of flexibility, but I wouldn't count it a big labor reform. So questions about regulation, questions on labor costs, which are essential for productivity, I don't think they will come out any time soon. Let me just move very quickly to the prospects for the elections. Again, first, what are the rules of the game in terms of election? Presidential elections, as in many presidential systems, are two rounds. If no candidate gets 50% of the vote, the two highest candidates go to a runoff. For the past 20 years or so, while Congress parliamentary has been highly fragmented, presidential elections have been a two-party game between the center-right Social Democratic Party, the party of President Fernando Henrique Cardoso in the 1990s, and more recently by the Workers' Party, the center-left. This is coming to an end, certainly for the Workers' Party, which I don't think have really any chance of winning the presidential election in 2018, even if President Lula is allowed to run, which is not certain by far. So what we will have is a much more fragmented presidential context. Now, if you are planning, you are playing a runoff system with a lot of candidates in the first round, it would be perfectly possible that a presidential candidate with maybe just over 20% of the vote will go to a runoff. So that makes very, very difficult to predict who will go to this runoff. And to make it still more important, all what you consider the kind of natural candidates of the mainstream parties at the time are or are likely to be investigated for corruption, which is not ideal to run for president. So, sorry, but the outcome of the presidential election is hardly difficult to predict, but a few pointers. As I said, the political class is bankrupted. We have seen what happened when there is this mistrust of the establishment in the United States and elsewhere. You have the possibility of outsiders, of populists, whatever you want to come up to the scene and save the country. Second question, how the economy will be performing in 2018. This again a big question mark. All recessions come to an end. The likelihood by the 2018 the recession in Brazil will come to an end, most likely sometime next year, but economic growth will be still very sort of anemic, maybe 2.5%. Would that be enough for the people to say, okay, we are turning the corner, we are going to support, the mainstream candidates, or people will feel that they are, as they will be, still sort of suffering the conditions that they are suffering now, which are extraordinary, and try to get a sort of more radical change. Having said that, I said that predictability, it is clear that candidates of the right and center right, whoever the candidate will be, we have quite a strong chance of winning the election. And I said, whoever this candidate will be, I think there are a couple of possibilities. If the economy turns around, if they can manage one way or the other this kind of corruption allegation, if the government is being able to deliver in many things, will not be impossible that you have some kind of either a coalition between the two main center-right parties, the PMDB and the PSDB. A name that is floating around is the finance minister, Enrique Meirelles, that have the great advantage of not being under investigation and not likely to be under investigation of corruption. So the savior of the economy could be a possible candidate. Under a less favorable scenario, you may have somebody outside the political class or the political elite. Now, having said that, you will not get somebody, be much more difficult at national election to have somebody that has not the backing of some of the main parties. Why? Because a key question for running for president is the free electoral time that is allocated by the Electoral Court in proportion to the seat that parties have in the National Congress. So parties are effectively have the key to electoral propaganda, to electoral publicity. So if you don't have the backing of a party, running as a complete outsider in a country like Brazil where you need television time would be difficult, not be impossible, difficult. So the scenario would be that this mainstream party will try to find someone from outside the political class, maybe a businessman, maybe a showman or whatever, to run for that country. But this is as far as I can say about that. Let me just round up very quickly with a few things about the economy. As you know, the sort of economic prospects are not great. In a context of a region that is not doing great, predictions for next year run from 0.5% by the IMF to 1%. The Minister of Finance previous projection was 1.6. Now they put it at 1.0%. The figure from yesterday, from quarterly figure, came too late when I was preparing this slide. The recent figures show that in the third quarter, the economy contracted by 0.8% in relation to previous quarter, 2.9% in relation to the same quarter last year. Awful as they are slightly better than the market prediction, which were 0.9 and 3%. So what they show is two things. First is that maybe the recession is beginning to bottom up. But second, there was also a big fall in investment of 3.1. That investor trust in the economy is still very, very fragile. In terms of the primary deficit and budget deficit, I think the government is likely to meet the target of this year, which is 2.6% of primary deficit to 2016, but still a huge deficit in the region, 6.something% of GDP, the overall deficit. They need to be addressed. In terms of the reform, I mentioned that. I think that the ceiling of public spending and pension reform, some kind of pension reform, are likely to be passed, and this will impact in the economic crisis. But political turbulence will remain high and potentially affect economic confidence. Let me just, when I said about the relation between the ceiling of public spending and pension reform, I show why the two are completely inseparable. This is from government, official projection from the government, and you can see there, this is public spending if no reforms are passed, if no ceiling to public spending is passed. And you can see it's not that it's so high, it's about the region of 20% of GDP. It's a trajectory that is unsustainable. So according to the government estimate by 2025, that will go from about 20% now to about 23% in 2015. With the ceiling in public spending is passed, it will come down to about 15% of GDP. Now, the second is about the social security. If no social security reform is passed, social security spending will be 9.6% of GDP by 2025. Now, going back, imagine this scenario. They pass the ceiling of public spending, so public spending comes down to 15%, just over 50%. And they don't pass Social Security, so Social Security will be 9% of GDP, so will be about two-thirds of total public spending, totally unsustainable. So the two will have to come together. I'm finishing now very briefly about investment protection. What are the prospects? What are the sort of expectations? How can Brazil will retake growth? Well, first by passing reform, bringing the public deficit to the sustainable trajectory, but this will be the necessary but not sufficient condition for economic growth. Of course, the necessary condition would be a huge increase in investment. Brazil now has one of the lowest rate of investment, according to recent figures I have had for ages. It's about 60%, 17% of GDP. With that level of investment, you will not get the retake of economic growth. So the great hope of the Brazilian government is basically you. The Brazilian government has no money, obviously, for public spending, so it's expecting to attract investment for people like you. And this is, again, this is taken from government official figures. The expectation of having a 270 billion program of private investment in the next 3 years or so, which most of that will be in oil, gas, energy, and telecommunications. And there will be a mixture of privatization, concession of public utilities, and public-private partnerships. And here you have some of the program that's, again, it's official Minister of Economy, Minister of Finance question, where some of the opportunities are in railways, highways, airports, privatization, ports, hydroelectric, and oil sector. And again, the oil sector would be key for that. And one thing is interesting that as the political crisis become worse, as it has been in the last few days or weeks because of the new allegation of corruption, the only alternative for the government is trying to speed up the program of reform with expectation that they will sort of bear fruit. And it's only yesterday that, coinciding with the question, President Temer announced publicly some of the questions that they are, some of the reform that promoting here, particularly the end of obligatory Petrobras pre-salt participation, so less local content, the sale assets of Petrobras going on, the ensuring that prices for fuel will be market-based, and the end of obligatory Petrobras pre-salt participation. So this is the best hope that the government will be, that will convince the private investor that in spite of the political fragility, in spite of the political uncertainty, the opportunities are too good for move, and that even with the political uncertainty, political fragility, it's very unlikely that whatever happens politically, the economic program will be very different from now. It's a big bet, but it's a bet. So, just to finish, is there light at the end of the tunnel? Well, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.